Hey everyone. So in the last video, we talked kind of about the history or the background of the Constitution. Now we're going to look at some of the Constitution itself and some of the things that it actually says in our Constitution of the United States. So again, this is how our government is structured. This is how our government is organized, and they wrote it down in what we call the Constitution. So today we're going to specifically look at three important and controversial compromises in the Constitution. That word compromise is a very important concept. So let's break that down here. A compromise is to settle differences, right? A compromise happens when people disagree about something and they need to settle their differences. Now, there's lots of ways you can settle a difference, right? You could fight and whoever wins gets their way. You could talk things over. You could draw straws. You could say, well, you get your way this time and I'll get my way that time. But what we're talking about this time is a compromise. A compromise is when we settle your differences by each side making concessions. That means they need to give something up to come up with a solution that solves the problem. So a compromise by definition means that both sides get a little bit of what they want, but also not everything that they want. So they get a little bit, but it also means they have to give up something that they want. So a compromise by definition, nobody is 100% happy, because with a compromise, you have to give up something that you want in order to get something else that you want, right? So we're going to be looking at three important compromises that are in our Constitution. And remember, these compromises came from those 55 delegates at the Constitutional Convention. And they were in that hot room in Philadelphia, sweating while they're arguing because they had no air conditioning back then, right? And they're figuring out, what should our government be? What should this country look like? And of course, they had different views and different opinions. So they had to compromise. They had to give up in order to get and come up with something that they could go along with, right? So the first compromise we're going to look at is called the Great Compromise. Like, it was such an amazing compromise that they call it great. What a creative name, right? The next one is the 3/5 Compromise and also the Slave Trade Compromise. So let's unpack these three compromises together. The first one is called the Great Compromise. And this really is a pretty big deal, because the Great Compromise is kind of what ended up creating our country to be what it is in terms of how our laws are made, how our government is run. So this really was a very big deal. So the Great Compromise really is a pretty fitting term, right? So the real question at hand was, how should Congress be set up? Now, Congress is this group of people that make laws for our country. And what we do is we send people from every state to go represent us in Congress. Now, the big states and the small states had different ideas for how we should decide how many people to send from each state to make laws for our whole country. So the big states, they had a proposal called the Virginia Plan. And it was called the Virginia Plan because somebody from Virginia came up with this plan. It also would have worked out for Virginia because Virginia was the biggest state at the time. And when I'm talking about size of the state, I'm talking about how many people live there. Not how big it is by area, but how many people live there. That's what makes it a big state. Okay. So at the time, Virginia was the biggest state in the country, and they proposed that Congress would have two houses, basically two different groups of Congresses, right? Rather than have one big group of people making laws for our country, they wanted to have two groups of people making laws for the country. And they said that the bigger the state is, the more votes they should get in each of the houses. This does kind of make sense. I mean, if more people live in Virginia, then the decisions that the United States Congress makes for the whole country will affect Virginians more than anyone else. So therefore, maybe Virginia should get to send more representatives to Congress to speak for their views, right? So while that does make sense, the smaller states were like, hey, we're states too. We matter. And so the small states didn't like this idea of bigger states getting to control everything just because they had more people living there. The smaller states wanted to have an equal say. So under the Virginia plan, bigger states would get to send more people to Congress. Therefore, bigger states would have more control and more power in the government. And the small states didn't like that idea. So the small states proposed the New Jersey plan. And New Jersey was one of the smaller states at the time. And someone from New Jersey had this idea. And they said, well, let's just have one house. It's silly to have two houses of Congress. Let's just have one group of people making laws. And each state, each state gets to have one vote, okay? One vote for each state, or in other words, one person. So one person gets to come from Virginia, one person gets to come from New Jersey, one person gets to come from Georgia, one person gets to come from New York. So at the time this would mean 13 people, right? 13 people would make up our Congress. Now, if they went forward with the New Jersey plan, then today we would have 50 people, right? Because we have 50 states. But at the time, there were only 13 states, and they said, well, maybe 13 people isn't enough to be making decisions for the whole country. And so under the New Jersey plan, every state would have gotten what we call equal representation. If every state gets one person or one vote, then every state is considered equally. And the little states loved this idea because they would have as much power as a big state. But the big states were like, hold on a minute. You little teeny tiny New Jersey, you shouldn't have as much power as us great big huge Virginia. Like, that means your vote weighs as much as our vote does. And we could have like teeny tiny New Jerseyans pushing around big gigantic Virginians. And so they had to come up with a compromise. They had to come up with a way to make both the big states and the little states happy. So the great compromise was this. They said, well, let's just take a little bit of each of those ideas. So they took the Virginia plan's idea of having two houses of Congress. And that's what we have today. We have something called the House of Representatives and the Senate. So we have two houses of Congress. But then each of those houses is going to have a different style of representation. In the House of Representatives, the big states are going to get what they want. The big states are going to have what we call proportional representation. Or in other words, the more people live in your state, the more representatives you get to send to the House of Representatives. So bigger states get more power and a louder voice and more votes in the House of Representatives because they have proportional representation. But then in the Senate would have equal representation. This means each state gets the same number of senators. And in this case, they decided 2 was appropriate. So every single state gets 2 senators. No matter how big or small the state is, 2 senators for every state. So this made the little states happy. The smaller states were happy because they had as much of a voice as the larger states did in the Senate. So under the Great Compromise, we're pretty much making big states happy because they have more power than smaller states in the House of Representatives. But the little states, the smaller states, they're happy because they have equal representation in the Senate. And this is the Great Compromise, and this is what we still do today. right? This is how our Congress is made up. We have a House of Representatives with proportional representation and a Senate with equal representation. Now let's do some quick math, okay? We have 50 states, so that means we have 100 total senators. How many representatives do we have in the House of Representatives? Remember what I was saying before, that if we only had 13 states and each state sent one person, then we'd only have 13 representatives. But that's not the case here. We have 50 states, and the bigger states get to send more people. So we have a total of 435 representatives in the House of Representatives. And California has the most because they have the most people living there. California has something like 54 representatives in the House of Representatives. And then there's states like Alaska and North Dakota and Wyoming that have one because not very many people live there. Okay, so that's how things work today. Moving on to the 3/5 compromise. You're not gonna like this one. Here's the problem. The problem is that slavery was still a thing, right? And that's been a problem for a lot of things in our history, isn't it? And as they were trying to create our new Constitution, slavery was still a thing in our early beginnings. And so the Southern states, they actually wanted their slaves to count as people. And that might strike you as odd because they weren't treating them like people. They were treating them like property, right? But in this case, they're saying, no, we totally want slaves to count as people because, I mean, they're humans, aren't they? That's what everyone tells us. So yeah, they're humans. We should count them as part of our population. But here's the funny thing. The Southern states, they wanted slaves to be counted so that they would make their population bigger, so that they could send more people to Congress, so they could have more control over the country. But they didn't want to be taxed for their slaves. So they wanted their cake and to eat it too. And that just wasn't going to work out for some of the states in the North that were starting to get rid of slavery at this time. So the Southern states said, no, we should totally count slaves as people when determining a state's population, because that would give the Southern state more power in Congress. But the Northern states were like, whoa, I know what you're up to. I see what you're doing here. You want your slaves to count as people so that you can have more representatives in Congress, right? So that you would have more power and control over the government, but you don't want to be taxed for them. That's not fair. And so the Northern states, get this, the Northern states were saying slaves should not count as people, which is backwards from how they felt in real life, right? In real life, it was the Northern states that are saying, hey, slavery's wrong. That's inhumane. We need to stop that because they're people, right? But in terms of this, in terms of creating the Constitution, the Northern states said, slaves shouldn't count as people because they're not being treated that way, right? And so the Northerners argued that because slaves weren't free, then they shouldn't be counted toward that state's population. If slaves were considered property, then they should count as property, not people in the population. But the Southern states were like, oh no, they should count as people because you think they're people, so we should count them as people. So it was this moral dilemma, but it was all about trying to prevent the Southern states from having more power than they should in Congress simply because they were counting their slaves, right? So here was their compromise, and this is the part you're not going to like. Instead of counting slaves as people, or instead of not counting them at all, instead of just calling them property, they said, well, we're going to count 3/5 of the slaves. And this was called the 3/5 compromise, that instead of valuing an enslaved person as a person, they were valuing enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. What? Can you imagine someone telling you that you're actually just a fraction of yourself, right? And that's what the 3/5 compromise said. The 3/5 compromise said that slaves were worth 3/5 of a person, right? Now, it's not like they were like, okay, so which 3/5 of you count? They were just counting 3/5 of the slaves when trying to figure out what that state's population was, in order to then decide how many representatives that state got to send to Congress. So this is all about power and control in the country. And rather than counting the slaves or not counting the slaves, they decided to count 3/5 of them as part of their population. And this is in our Constitution. This went into this historical document, right? Our Constitution, this binding document that explains what our country is all about, says African Americans who are enslaved are worth 3/5 of a person. And that's in the Constitution. Told you that one was going to make some of your blood boil, right? And now, if you didn't like that one, here comes another doozy. The slave trade compromise. So once again, they had to figure out as best they could, what should we do about slavery? As we're starting this country fresh again, what should we do about the slave trade? And in hindsight, we now know that it took until the Civil War in the 1860s to finally bring slavery to an end. And here they are, like, starting the discussion in the 1780s, right? So the North was worried that now that they have the 3/5 compromise, they were worried that the southern states, that's what it is. They were worried that the southern states would just bring more and more and more slaves. Because even though they only counted as 3/5 of a person, they still counted as 3/5 of a person. And so they were concerned that the South would just say, all right, we'll just bring a whole bunch more slaves into our state, and then the population of our state will be bigger, and then we can send more representatives to Congress, and then we can control the country. This is what the North was worried about. So they said, well, you can only bring in so many slaves a year, right? They actually put a cap on the number of slaves that could be imported into the United States. In other words, the Constitution allowed a certain number of slaves to be imported into the country each year, right? So you could read that two ways. You could say, well, they were limiting it. They were stopping it like somewhere. But what it actually means is our brand new government, right, starting over with a fresh new constitution, is allowing slavery to continue, right? Beyond that, they also said, well, we'll even allow it to happen until the year 1808. So they actually wrote it into the Constitution, not our problem. Let's make our children deal with this when they're adults. That's in the Constitution. The Constitution allows slavery to continue happening until 1808, right? So this is the slave trade. So there's a little bit of a difference between the slave trade and slavery. And as history would unfold, the United States actually did beat the deadline by 1 year. In 1807, they made the slave trade illegal. That means they stopped importing slaves from Africa to be sold in America. But slavery was still a thing. And the existing slaves, the existing people who were enslaved in the United States, were still enslaved and would continue to be enslaved for generations to come. So again, the slave trade compromise allowed slavery, and it actually made slavery legal in the Constitution. This is why Abraham Lincoln in 1863, like, what would that be, 70 years later or so? 70 years later, Abraham Lincoln is trying to free the slaves, and he can't because the Constitution allows it. And that's why he had to come up with his creative Emancipation Proclamation. Remember that one? If you don't, you should go back and look it up, right? All right, there we go. Those are the 3 compromises. There were many other compromises in the Constitution, but those are the 3 truly controversial ones. And we'll be unpacking those a little bit more in our discussions in class, okay?